To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm honored to be joined by returning guest and dear friend of the panel, the brilliant Deshawn Harrison, to talk about their recent essay for Scalawag magazine called Let Us Explain Body Fascism. Deshawn is a queer and trans theorist, anarcho-communist, Afro-pessimist, and Southern-born and bred abolitionist based in Atlanta. They're an author, lecturer, researcher, editor, and a movement media and narrative strategist. Their award-winning book, Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, is a path-breaking intervention and the key text in Black fat studies. Just hands down, an absolute must-read fantastic book. Deshawn also is a co-executive director of Scalawag magazine, a co-host of the podcast Unsolicited Fatties Talk Back, and one-third of the video podcast In the Middle. Deshawn, welcome to the Death Panel. It's so great to have you back on the show.
It is so great to be back. I love it here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm just so grateful to be talking about this together today. And I want to just sort of start with the essay that brings us into this conversation. Again, as I mentioned, published in Scalawag magazine, called Let Us Explain Body Fascism. We'll link to it in the episode description. In it, you introduce readers to the concept of body fascism, which basically just describes how a particular quote unquote ideal body gets elevated as, almost like a patriotic symbol of the nation itself. In that framework, bodies that, of course, fall outside of that ideal are structurally funneled towards neglect, correction, or erasure, which then acts as a kind of mechanism of basically value inflation, reifying the fascist ideal body and then framing it as if there is sort of some quote unquote natural advantage that is simply being realized or reflected rather than a deliberately structurally engineered strategy of devaluation.
Right.
And I think the way that you refuse to also entertain the idea that these dynamics are just about maybe beauty standards or personal health choices is a really important detail, and part of why I think it's such an important idea to really sit with and think with right now. And in the piece, you show also how hierarchies of the body are really just embedded in institutions, whether we're talking about medicine, education, media, the state, et cetera, and how those institutions really ultimately use this fascist body as a means of distributing care, legitimacy, and protection according to proximity to that ideal body. So really, to echo a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore that was central to our analysis in the episode that we did recently called Health Fascism and the Anti-State State.
Yes.
Quote, "Nowadays, it seems to many observers as though there was never a time when things were different. Thus, normalization slips into naturalization." And while Ruthie was speaking to the naturalization of prisons and carcerality, it is just an enduringly relevant frame for all politics of the body, which is to say, all politics.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that argument really, as I said, it feels especially urgent right now. And we're just obviously living in a moment where conversations about strength, health, personal discipline, productivity, reproduction are increasingly tied to discourse around nationalist politics, mainstream discourses, both formal and informal. And we're also seeing hostility toward fat, disabled, and trans bodies intensifying, which I think it's worth saying this has been happening for many years, especially the last, decade plus. But I think we've seen a concentrated acceleration coming in with, the rise to power of the second Trump administration, sort of via the avenue of Make America Healthy Again. So with all that said, to begin, I'd love to just ask you to walk us through the term body fascism, especially for folks who haven't yet read your piece in Scalawag. When you say body fascism, what are you naming that other frameworks like maybe diet culture, or fat phobia, or wellness ideology fail to fully capture here? And also, can you talk about why it's important that we recognize that, the body itself is being mobilized as a nationalist symbol right now and sort of what that helps to make visible for folks?
Yeah, this is one. I want to say the episode's already over because you just went through everything and did it beautifully and perfectly. Um, but this is a really, really, really brilliant question. And I'm grateful that you're like, give me the space to sort of tease this out. So first off, I pulled this essay. This essay is actually a tiny part of my much, much longer book proposal because I am writing a book about this exact thing.
Hell yeah.
And I needed to be able to introduce, or rather, I think that people have a right to and deserve access to an analysis that situates this moment within its full historical and political context, right? And that people have access to an analysis that names it for what it is, which is body fascism. And so when I talk about body fascism, what I'm saying is that body fascism is not reducible to just gym culture or dieting trends or beauty standards, even though all of those are very integral to my overall critique, just to be clear. But body fascism, it names a broader political project. It is about the deepening of capitalist discipline through the governance of the body and more accurately through the governance of the flesh when referring to Black fat folks. And so it's a system that mobilizes medical authority, that mobilizes pharmaceutical intervention, that mobilizes cultural shame, that mobilizes economic pressure to produce a standardized body, one that is productive, that is compliant, that is legible, and with the intent to unveil this sort of spectacle that is fascism. And the reason why I'm explaining it that way is because I know one one critique that I thought was pretty baseless, but that I'm going to entertain anyway because I know that I think it'll be a larger critique that people have.
It'll be productive.
Yes, it'll be productive. Exactly. Thank you. One critique that I saw under the Instagram comments when we posted about this essay was that this is not fascism, right? So what I wanted to name was that fascism is not just the spectacle, right? It's not just the spectacle of a death camp. And that in order for you to be experiencing this sort of iteration of body fascism, there has to be an ongoing struggle. There's this like ongoing staircase is what I'm calling it in my book, that leads to an ultimate level of spectacle that we usually see when we talk about fascism. So what I mean by that is, when we think about fascism, we think about the Aryan body, we think about the new Jewish body as the Zionist project, right? And so we think about, the Israeli state, we think about Nazi Germany. But in order for those regimes to ever have existed, there had to have been entire steps that took place prior to that moment for those regimes to ever come online. And that is what body fascism sort of makes room for. So what I'm naming here is that this standardized body is not merely aesthetic, it is very political, or rather that because aesthetic cannot be depoliticized, because aestheticism cannot be depoliticized, the standardization of the body cannot be either. So when readers, resist this framing by saying that it bastardizes Marxist terminology or that it dilutes the concept because we're not yet living under the spectacle of death camps, what I'm saying is that fascism has never required immediate spectacle. And in fact, the deep crisis or the deep crises produced by capitalist violence are what undergird the spectacle at its core. So in order for fascism to ever get to the moment in which we can name its spectacle, there must first be a deepening of the capitalist violence that we experience. And that requires a neoliberal democracy. That is what we've experienced over the last, like you said, 10 years plus, but it's been much longer than 10 years. It's what we experienced under a Barack Obama presidency. It's what we've experienced under a Biden-Harris presidency and vice presidency. That is what it looks like to sort of build up into, to create a fascist moment that allows for a Trump presidency wherein a Make America Healthy Again campaign run by RFK Jr. can't even be possible. And so for me, I'm writing this essay and I'm writing this book in a moment marked by post-COVID re-normalization of triage and abandonment, the explosion of wellness authoritarianism, the pharmaceuticalization of discipline, and our refusal to name these things as fascist. That's the context under which I'm writing this. And that is exactly where I'm sort of pulling these ideas from to talk about in this moment. And that is what body fascism is. It is about amplifying or promoting this ideal body type as the body type that represents a national image that allows for the nation to push its nationalist ideals with the intent to erase, dismiss, genocide entire bodies of people. And unless and until we acknowledge that as true, as fact, we will get pushed and pulled into the spectacle that we understand fascism to be and be asking ourselves how we arrived here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. 100%. And if you'll permit me to push back that critique that you received for a second.
Please, yes.
It reminds me of the conversation I had recently with Alberto Toscano about his book from a couple of years ago, Late Fascism, where Toscano talks about the idea of fascist freedom, which at first, to some people who still think about maybe like liberal democracy and fascism as being diametrically opposed political dynamics, that might seem like counterintuitive or contradictory, right? And Toscano, a lot of that book is basically saying that there is very little about liberalism that is actually incompatible with fascism, that these two things build off each other.
Right.
And that, there is a lot of harm in sort of the perpetuation of the idea that there is a kind of default opposite to fascism, right, in liberalism. But so Toscano talks in the book about the idea of fascist freedom, which he says, this is not the absence of state power. Like a lot of times when we think about like the libertarian framing of freedom, right, and that being a kind of retraction of the state, this is very different, right? This is a reactionary redefinition of freedom as the right of a dominant population to be unencumbered by those who are cast as burdens, as threats, or frankly, as contaminants, right? And this is freedom secured through hierarchy, which is a freedom to exclude, to dominate, and to purify the social body. And ultimately, this is why body fascism is fascism, right? This is a political formation in which health and the body become the terrain through which fascist freedom is articulated and also defended, right? Freedom is reframed as the right of the quote unquote healthy, productive, and normatively fit to live without being dragged down, so to speak, by the sick, the racialized, disabled, poor, migrants, fat folks, just anyone marked as dependent, right? And so what we have under this regime, and this is not just like important as an analytic, is that what this regime produces is that collective provisioning is recoded as theft, right? Care is recoded as indulgence. And structural obligation and responsibility for each other and for interdependence just being a bare fact of life becomes recoded as oppression, right? And so the fascist freedom promise is one of liberation from burdens, right? And those burdens are other people. And this formation is also inseparable from racial capitalism, right? Racial capitalism organizes value through racial differentiation by assigning differential worth and vulnerability and disposability to people in order to extract labor and secure accumulation. And so health and the body has always functioned within the system as a technology of classification, right? And so body fascism is absolutely fascism. And just because you are not subject, the commenter, not you, Deshaun, but just because one is not subject themselves, that their body is not subject to the spectacle of a death camp, doesn't mean that there are not many other people who are subject to that spectacle, right?
Exactly.
And that relationality, that your body that has maybe a status right now of exception from participation in that spectacle, you're not being shipped off to Dili, being exposed to measles, right? in like conditions of absolute abject assault on the body through detention, right? But your relationality to that, right? That is body fascism, right? The distance between you and someone who's being detained by ICE and sent to a concentration camp in Texas, that relationship is body fascism. Exactly. It is fascism. And you can't really get out of it by saying, oh, we're not quite there yet.
Right. The argument was like, well, GLP-1s are not a fascist, or people using GLP-1s is not fascist. And I'm like, hey. So just because people are not dying in droves yet due to GLP-1 usage does not mean that it's not fascism, right? Like the research shows that increasingly, more and more people are having direct complications that they're experiencing based on the usage of GLP-1s. But what we also see is that weight loss as a project is being used to determine citizenship under this current regime, right? So like, it's not silly or ridiculous to think of those two things in context, that if people are being required to, quote unquote, be healthy and therefore required to lose weight, in order to achieve or try to achieve citizenship, that there's fascism happening in this moment, right? But because they're not experiencing the direct ramifications of that, like you just named, then it appears it's like, oh, this is not what that looks like, right? But my entire pushback with that is that, one, fascism and body fascism have two very different genealogies and histories that I think culturally absolutely do overlap. But to erase one would be to actively erase the other. And I think that because we don't want to think about, well, I'll rephrase, because we're the only ones, and by we, I mean those of us who exist with marginalized bodies and flesh, are the ones who are theorizing around body fascism specifically, and not so much the larger fascist ideology. It gets dismissed. It gets, pushed aside as something that doesn't matter. But the work that we do actively contributes to our thinking around and our theorizing around fascism as an ideology, as a structure, as this post-World War response to social movements, right? The entire purpose of fascism is to quell social movements with the intent of building a standardized body that must fight for and that must represent the nation, that is predicated on some sort of homogenizing or sort of like organizing around a specific ideal, right? That is what fascism looks like. It is intended to act not just as this sort of authoritarian regime, but it's something that goes beyond that, right? I know that, we use language like open terrorist dictatorship, right? Or other language like that, but it's only possible through the creation of this sort of standardizing of this normalization of an ideal body that must represent the nation. And you don't get that without body fascism. You don't get to that point where people are forced to fight for the state as citizens without body fascism first offering the pressure that requires people to reach that sort of standard, right? And I think that is what people oftentimes miss in these conversations. And it's exactly why I'm writing this book. I'm hoping to clarify for folks that the moment that we're in is very severe, and it's very severe because there are some folks who don't recognize this moment as the fascist moment that it is. And then there are some folks who refuse to acknowledge the fact that in order for us to even get to this moment, we must normalize and accept a neoliberal democracy that we've been living under for so long. And that is why we're here. And I think what I really want folks to just be super clear about is that under body fascism, whereas under capitalism, you are always already a commodity. Your body is always already a commodity. Body fascism pushes that to another degree, another space where it names then like, this is no longer a personal choice, right? You're not going to quote unquote get fit because of a personal choice, which I argue is never a personal choice. But you're never like going to prioritize quote unquote health as a personal choice. It becomes the organizing principle of the nation, where it separates individual decision making and places it into a collective problem that must be solved by all of us by conforming to this ideal. For me, it's just like, once you push individual people to conform to a national standard, to conform to a very strict, a very idealized body standard, and you call it health and you call it whatever else you want to call it, right? You know, even folks on the left calling it, you know, are you fitter than the fascist? Like that is what body fascism looks like in real time. And our refusal to acknowledge that doesn't mean that it isn't happening, that it isn't true.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.